Stupid teens, mock old man, don't notice royal guard behind. The morning fog hung low over London like a ghostly veil, wrapping palace in a mysterious embrace. As the mist began to lift, revealing the magnificent building's golden gates, tourists gathered in growing numbers, their excitement building for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Camera flashes pierced the air like tiny lightning bolts, and the crowd's chatter created a living buzz of anticipation. Among the sea of eager faces and raised smartphones stood a solitary figure who seemed to belong to a different time altogether. Harold Bennett, though no one in the crowd knew his name, stood perfectly still, his weathered hands resting on a polished wooden cane. Unlike the tourists around him who frantically jostled for the perfect photo angle, he simply gazed at the palace with an intensity that spoke of something deeper than mere tourist curiosity. His coat, though clearly old, was meticulously pressed, every crease telling its own story of care and dignity. The garment hung slightly loose on his frame, suggesting a man who had once carried more weight, more strength. Yet there was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that hinted at a military bearing that decades of civilian life hadn't managed to erase. A group of teenagers, fresh from their morning classes at a nearby school, drifted through the crowd like sharks sensing weakness. Their uniform ties hung loose around their necks, and their laughs carried that particular edge of youth that hadn't yet learned the weight of consequence. The leader of the pack, a boy named Marcus with carefully styled hair and expensive trainers, spotted Harold first. "Oi, check it out!" Marcus nudged his friends, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of amusement and cruelty that only teenagers seem to master. "Grandpa's having a moment." His friends, Tom, Sophia, and James, turned to look, already grinning in anticipation of whatever entertainment their leader had spotted. They saw Harold, standing alone, his eyes fixed on the palace with an unwavering gaze that seemed to look through the present and into something far beyond. "Maybe he's waiting for his royal invitation," Sophia chimed in, twirling her phone between her fingers. The group snickered, but there was something about Harold's stillness that made their laughter sound hollow, almost forced. The old man didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence. His eyes remained locked on the palace gates as if he was seeing something there that no one else could. Tom, always eager to prove himself to the group, stepped closer. "Oi, mate," he called out, his voice carrying across the space between them. "You know they don't do palace tours for another hour, yeah?" Still nothing. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. The teenager's amusement began to curdle into something closer to annoyance. People usually reacted, they got angry or embarrassed or walked away. But Harold's complete indifference to their presence was somehow worse than any reaction they might have expected. What none of them could see was the way Harold's mind was elsewhere, lost in memories that played out against the backdrop of the palace like scenes from an old film reel. In his mind's eye, he saw not the tourist attraction of today, but a different London entirely. A London of sandbags and air raid sirens, of rationing books and blackout curtains. A London where young men in uniform walked the streets with a mix of pride and fear in their eyes, knowing they might be shipping out at any moment. The royal guards stood at their posts, resplendent in their red uniforms and bearskin hats, seemingly as immobile as statues. But one of them, the one stationed nearest to Harold, was different. Though his posture remained perfect, his eyes, barely visible under the shadow of his bearskin, kept drifting to the old man's face. Marcus, frustrated by Harold's continued silence, decided to up the ante. He moved closer, his friends trailing behind him like a wake of uncertainty. "What's the matter, old-timer? Lost in the good old days when you were somebody important?" It was then that Harold did something unexpected. He smiled. Not at the teenagers, not at anyone in particular. It was the kind of smile that suggested he knew something they didn't, something that made their mockery seem small and insignificant in comparison. The nearby tourists, who had been pretending not to notice the scene unfolding before them, began to shift uncomfortably. A mother pulled her young children closer. An elderly couple exchanged knowing glances. But still, no one intervened. They all remained trapped in that peculiarly British tendency to avoid confrontation at all costs. The guard nearest to Harold, whose name tag read, Phillips, remained motionless, but something had changed in his stance. There was a tension in his shoulders now, a barely perceptible shift in his grip on his rifle. To anyone who knew what to look for, it was clear. The guard was listening intently to every word. Harold's smile faded slowly, replaced by an expression of such profound sadness that even Marcus felt a flicker of shame. The old man's eyes never left the palace, but his lips moved slightly, forming words too quiet for anyone to hear. Anyone except Guard Phillips, whose eyes widened ever so slightly behind the shadow of his bearskin hat. The teenagers, their bravado beginning to waver, glanced at each other uncertainly. They had expected entertainment, maybe even a reaction they could film and post online. Instead, they found themselves caught in something they didn't understand, something that made their attempted mockery feel increasingly childish and out of place. A cold wind swept across the palace grounds, carrying with it the distant chime of Big Ben striking 10. The sound seemed to stir something in Harold, and for the first time since his arrival, he reached into his coat pocket. His trembling fingers emerged clutching what appeared to be an old, leather wallet, its surface cracked and worn by time. Marcus, still determined to get a reaction, noticed the movement. "Oh, look! Granddad's got his warm metals, bet you anything." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty now. Something about the old man's demeanor had begun to affect him, though he never admitted. Sophia, however, had started to distance herself from the group's mockery. Her eyes were fixed on Harold's hands as they carefully opened the wallet. "Maybe we should just leave him alone," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. But Tom, feeding off Marcus's lead, stepped closer. "What V you got there, old-timer? Love letters?" The wallet fell open, and a small photograph fluttered to the ground. Before Harold could reach for it, the wind caught it, sending it dancing through the air. With surprising speed for a man his age, Harold lunged forward, but his cane slipped on the damp pavement. The crowd gasped, expecting him to fall. But Guard Phillips's eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the photograph as it sailed past him. James, the quietest of the teenage group, acted on instinct. He darted forward and caught the photo just before it could land in a nearby puddle. As his fingers closed around it, he glimpsed its contents, a black and white image of two young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of what appeared to be a military hospital. One of the soldiers was clearly a much younger Harold, but the other. James's eyes widened as he looked from the photograph to Guard Phillips, then back again. The resemblance was unmistakable. "Sir," James said, his voice suddenly respectful as he turned toward Harold. "I think this belongs to you." But before he could return the photograph, a loud commotion erupted at the palace gates. A group of protesters had somehow slipped past the initial security barriers, waving signs and chanting about climate change. The crowd began to shift and surge as palace security moved to intercept the protesters. In the chaos, Harold stumbled again. This time, his cane clattered to the ground, and he would have followed if not for James's quick reaction. The young man caught Harold's arm, steadying him, the photograph still clutched in his other hand. "Thank you, lad," Harold spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a strength that belied his fragile appearance. "But it's not me you should be worried about." Before James could ask what he meant, Harold's eyes fixed on something behind them. The protesters had broken through the second security line and were rushing toward the palace gates. Guard Phillips remained at his post, as protocol demanded, but his face had gone pale. Then Harold did something extraordinary. He straightened up, seemed to grow taller, and his voice rang out across the courtyard with a command that cut through the chaos. "Phillips! Left flank!" The guard's head snapped toward Harold, training warring with protocol. In that split second, one of the protesters broke away from the group, running straight toward Phillips with something clutched in their hand. What happened next would later be debated in newspapers across the country. Some would say it was just coincidence, others would call it muscle memory from years of military training. But at that moment, Guard Phillips, breaking decades of tradition, stepped sideways, just as the protester's hidden can of spray paint sailed through the air where his head had been moments before. The crowd fell silent. The protesters froze. And in that moment of perfect stillness, James looked down at the photograph in his hand again. The second soldier in the image, the one standing next to young Harold, wore a name tag that read, Phillips. Marcus and Tom had gone very quiet. Sophia's hand was covering her mouth. Because now they all saw what James had realized. The old man they'd been mocking wasn't just some random tourist lost in memories of glory days. He was something else entirely. And Guard Phillips knew exactly who he was. The silence was broken by the sharp sound of boots on pavement as palace security swarmed in to detain the protesters. But Harold's eyes never left Guard Phillips, and the guard's posture had changed subtly, as if fighting every instinct to maintain his ceremonial stance. James still held the photograph, his fingers trembling slightly as he finally understood its significance. This wasn't just a picture of two young soldiers. It was evidence of a connection that spanned generations, a debt that had never been fully repaid. And somehow, he knew they were all about to witness its resolution. As security officers led the protesters away, a distinguished-looking woman in a crisp navy suit emerged from a side entrance of the palace. Her bearing and the respectful way the other officers deferred to her marked her as someone of authority. She surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, taking in the scattered signs, the unsettled crowd, and finally, Harold. Her steps faltered for just a moment when she saw him. "Commander Bennett?" she called out, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. The teenagers exchanged startled looks. "Commander?" Harold turned toward her voice, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, certainly, but also something deeper, more complex. "Julia," he said softly. "You're the spitting image of your grandmother." The woman, Julia, moved through the crowd with purpose now. "I never thought," she began, then collected herself. "We've been waiting for you, sir. Though I must admit, we expected you to use the private entrance." Marcus, who had been trying to fade into the background, couldn't help himself. "Private entrance?" Julia glanced at him, then at the photograph still in James's hand. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand. James surrendered it reluctantly. She studied the image for a long moment, then pulled out her phone and made a brief call. "He's here," was all she said before hanging up. Harold's voice cut through the murmurs of the gathering crowd. "The promise wasn't about a private entrance, Julia. It was about standing here, exactly here, where it all began." "Where what began?" Sophia asked, her earlier mockery forgotten in the face of this unfolding mystery. Julia looked at Harold, who nodded slightly. "Operation Lionhart," she said, her voice dropping to near a whisper. "The mission that was too sensitive to ever be made public." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for details of this revelation. Even the remaining royal guards seemed to be listening intently while maintaining their posts. Harold with his strong voice said his story. Julia continued the story, her eyes never leaving Harold's face. "What the history books don't tell you is that there was a team, a very special team, tasked with stopping this threat. 5 men, chosen for their unique skills, led by the youngest commander in British military history." "You?" James asked Harold, who nodded slowly. "Phillips was our radio man," Harold said, gesturing toward the guard's post. "His father. Best damn operator I ever knew. Saved all our lives that night with his quick thinking." Guard Phillips's shoulders straightened imperceptibly at the mention of his father. "But that's not why you're here today, is it, Commander?" Julia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Harold's eyes took on a distant look. "No. The mission, that was just the beginning. What happened 3 months later, in a field hospital in France?" He stopped, his hand tightening on his cane. "That's when the promise was made." The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the distant sound of approaching helicopters. Julia checked her phone, then looked at Harold with newfound urgency. "Sir, they're coming. Are you sure you want to do this here? Now?" Harold's response was interrupted by a commotion from the palace gates. They were opening, not the usual small gap for tourists, but fully opening. A motorcade was approaching. The teenagers, who had started this morning thinking they were just going to mock an old man, found themselves at the center of what was clearly becoming a significant event. James still stood close to Harold, protective now rather than mocking. Marcus and Tom had backed away slightly, looking both ashamed and fascinated. Sophia had her phone out but wasn't filming. Something told her this moment deserved more respect than that. "Julia," Harold said, his voice carrying a note of command that made everyone stand a little straighter. "There's something else they need to know. About the photograph. About why young Phillips here stands at exactly this post, on exactly this day." But before Julia could respond, a sharp crack echoed across the plaza, the sound of ancient wood finally giving way. Harold's cane, stressed beyond its limits during the earlier chaos, split clean through. As he stumbled, three things happened simultaneously. James lunged to catch him, Guard Phillips took an instinctive step forward, and Julia's phone buzzed with an incoming message that made her face pale. "Sir," she said urgently, "they found it. The bunker. It's still there." Harold steadied himself, looking at the approaching motorcade, then at Guard Phillips, and finally at the teenagers who had started this whole chain of events with their thoughtless mockery. "Well then," he said, a glimmer of his old strength showing through, "it's time they all learned what really happened in that field hospital. And why the Phillips family has stood guard here, every year on this day, for 3 generations. The motorcade was getting closer, and with it, the weight of history seemed to press down on them all. Because now they understood, this wasn't just about a promise. The motorcade stopped at the palace gates, and the crowd fell into a hushed silence as 3 black vehicles pulled through. From the central car emerged a tall, elderly gentleman in a meticulously tailored suit, his silver hair catching the morning light. Even those who didn't recognize him could sense his importance from the way security personnel snapped to attention. "Sir Malcolm Phillips," Julia whispered to the teenagers, who were now completely engrossed in the unfolding drama. "Guard Phillips's uncle, and the last surviving member of Commander Bennett's team besides Harold himself." Sir Malcolm walked directly toward their group, his pace deliberate but urgent. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path. As he approached, his eyes locked onto Harold, and for a moment, both men simply stared at each other, 7 decades of shared history passing between them in a single glance. "You stubborn old fool," Sir Malcolm said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have told me you were coming." Harold managed a small smile. "And break protocol, Malcolm? Not likely." The teenagers watched in fascination as Sir Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax. "They found this in the bunker," he said, holding it out to Harold. "Right where you said it would be." Harold's hands trembled as he took the envelope. "After all these years," he murmured. "Did you open it?" "Couldn't if I wanted to," Sir Malcolm replied. "The seal, well, see for yourself." The teenagers crowded closer, curiosity overwhelming their earlier shame. The seal bore a symbol none of them recognized, an intricate pattern of interlocked lions and crowns. "That's the private seal," Julia explained quietly. "From 1943. James, who had remained close to Harold, noticed the old man's hands shaking more violently now. "Sir," he said, "would you like me to?" Harold nodded gratefully, passing him the envelope. "Careful with the seal, lad. That's a piece of history you're holding." As James carefully broke the seal, a small key fell into his palm, old, brass, and surprisingly heavy for its size. Along with it came a single sheet of paper, the handwriting faded but still legible. Sir Malcolm's breath caught. "Is that authorizing what we had to do that night in the field hospital?" He turned to Guard Phillips, who remained at his post but was now visibly struggling to maintain his ceremonial stance. "Your grandfather didn't die saving my life, son. He died saving something far more precious." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as 2 military aircraft appeared overhead. Julia's phone buzzed again, and this time when she read the message, she actually gasped. "Sir," she said to Harold, "the bunker team, they found it. Exactly where you said it would be. After all these years." "Found what?" Marcus asked, his earlier arrogance completely forgotten. Harold looked at Sir Malcolm, who nodded slowly. "Tell them," the latter said. "It's time they knew. The night Phillips's grandfather died," Harold began, his voice carrying clearly despite its age. "We weren't just running a routine mission. We were transporting something so valuable that its very existence had to be kept secret for 70 years. He gestured to the key in James's hand. "That opens a very special vault in the palace. One that contains proof of what really happened during Operation Lionhart." The teenagers leaned in closer, completely captivated. Even Sophia had forgotten about her phone. Sir Malcolm continued. "If we couldn't safely transport the item back to London, we were to destroy it, and ourselves along with it. No traces could be left." "But Phillips's grandfather," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. "He found another way. In that field hospital, surrounded by enemy forces, he made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure we could complete our mission. And before he died, he made me promise." He trailed off as a commotion erupted at the palace entrance. Several officials in formal dress were hurrying down the steps, led by a distinguished-looking woman whom everyone immediately recognized from countless photographs and news broadcasts. "Is that?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide. Julia nodded. "The private secretary. This isn't just about a wartime promise anymore. This is about—" She was interrupted by a sharp command from the palace steps. "Guard Phillips! You are relieved of your post." The crowd watched in amazement as another guard quickly marched up to replace Phillips at his position. But instead of returning to the palace, Phillips was directed to join the growing group around Harold. For the first time in hours, Phillips could move freely, and the first thing he did was reach into his uniform pocket and pull out something that made both Harold and Sir Malcolm freeze in recognition. It was another key, identical to the one from the envelope. "My grandfather's last letter," Phillips said, speaking for the first time, his voice tight with emotion. "He wrote that you'd come today, Commander Bennett. That you'd bring the other key. He said that only when both keys were united could the truth finally be told." The private secretary had reached their group now, her expression a mixture of urgency and awe. "Commander Bennett," she said formally, "we require your presence. Immediately." Harold straightened up, decades seeming to fall away from his bearing. "The teenagers come too," he said firmly, surprising everyone. "They need to see this. They need to understand why we fight our wars, why we keep our promises, and why some rules," he glanced at Phillips with a knowing look, "are made to be broken when honor demands it." The private secretary hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Very well. Follow me, all of you. It's time to open a door that's been sealed for 70 years. As they began to move toward the palace steps, James found himself walking beside Harold. "Sir?" he asked quietly. "What will we find in that vault?" Harold's eyes twinkled with a mixture of mischief and solemnity. "The real reason, young man, why the Phillips family has kept their post here, generation after generation, guarding a secret they didn't even fully understand." The group followed the private secretary through corridors that grew progressively older and narrower. The polished marble of the public areas gave way to worn stone, and the air took on the musty scent of age. Their footsteps echoed off walls that had witnessed centuries of history. Marcus, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke. "These passages, they're not on any tourist map, are they?" "They're not on any map at all," the private secretary replied, stopping before what appeared to be a solid stone wall. "For good reason." She pressed her hand against a particular stone, and with a grinding sound that spoke of ancient machinery, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. "The medieval foundations," Sir Malcolm explained as they began their descent. "Built on the ruins of a much older structure. One that held secrets even the Normans didn't fully understand." Motion-activated lights flickered to life as they descended, casting dramatic shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their breath began to mist in the air. After what seemed like an eternity of spiraling downward, they reached a chamber that made the teenagers gasp. The circular room was lined with shelves carved directly into the bedrock, each holding artifacts that seemed to span centuries, ancient scrolls, metallic devices of unknown purpose, and items that seemed to defy explanation. But it was the center of the room that drew everyone's attention. There stood a pedestal of black marble, its surface etched with the same symbol that had sealed the envelope, the private seal. In the pedestal were two keyholes, positioned exactly a hand's width apart. "Your grandfather," Harold said to Guard Phillips, "understood what we'd found in that field hospital. He knew it had to be protected, not destroyed. That's why he gave his life, to give us time to bring it here." The teenagers exchanged skeptical looks, but Harold raised his hand for silence. "I know how it sounds, but I saw it work." "But you stopped them," James said. "You and Phillips's grandfather." Harold nodded. "We stole it from their research facility. But by the time we reached the field hospital, they'd caught up to us." "Your grandfather?" He looked at Guard Phillips. "He realized we couldn't destroy it. The knowledge it contained was too valuable. So he created a diversion, led the enemies away. With his last breath, he gave me his key and made me promise to protect not just the stone, but the truth about why he died." Guard Phillips stepped forward, his ceremonial stoicism finally breaking. "All these years, my family kept watch, not knowing exactly what we were guarding. Just that it was important enough for my grandfather to die for. And now," the private secretary said, "it's time to see if what we found in the bunker is what we think it is. Commander Bennett, Guard Phillips, the keys, please." James handed Harold his key, and both men approached the pedestal. The air seemed to grow thicker with anticipation as they positioned their keys. "On three," Harold said softly. 1, 2, 3. They turned the keys simultaneously. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low humming filled the chamber, and the pedestal began to sink into the floor, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as they watched. Harold reached for it with trembling hands. "Sir," Julia said suddenly, checking her phone. "The bunker team just sent this." She held out her phone, showing what appeared to be photographs of ancient drawings. "They found these carved into the walls. They're exact replicas of the carvings on that box." "Not replicas," Sir Malcolm said quietly. "Warnings." Harold's hands hesitated over the box. "Your grandfather knew," he said to Phillips. "He knew we couldn't destroy it, but we also couldn't risk anyone using it. So he made sure it would stay protected until the right moment, when both keys could be united." "And you think that moment is now?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect that would have been unthinkable just hours ago. Harold looked at the teenagers, then at Phillips, and finally at Sir Malcolm. "This secret has been kept for 70 years. 3 generations of the Phillips family have guarded it." The box opened with a soft click, releasing a gentle luminescence that filled the chamber with a warm, golden glow. Inside, a crystal sphere no larger than a tennis ball. Its surface seemed to ripple like water, and within its depths, images flickered and swirled. But before anyone could speak, the sphere pulsed with light, and suddenly the air around them shimmered. "Take it," Phillips's grandfather said in the vision, his voice echoing through time. "But promise me something, Harold. Promise me that one day, when the time is right, you'll show them what we really saw." The teenagers watched in amazement. Julia checked her phone one last time and smiled. "The bunker team just confirmed it. The drawings on the walls, they're not warnings. They're instructions. Left by your grandfather, showing how to use the stone for healing. For hope." Guard Phillips finally moved from his rigid stance, stepping closer to the sphere. As he did, the vision shifted again, showing his grandfather's final moments. But instead of fear or regret, his face showed peace, even joy. "He knew," Phillips said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "He knew that someday, his family would stand guard not just over a secret, but over the promise of a better future." Harold looked at the teenagers, Marcus, Tom, Sophia, and James, who had begun this day with mockery and were ending it with understanding. As they made their way back up to the palace proper, Harold pulled the teenagers aside. "Your generation will face great challenges," he said. "But now you know something few others do, that humanity's capacity for good will always outweigh its capacity for evil. That's worth protecting. Worth fighting for." Marcus, who had started the day mocking an old man, now stood straight and proud. "We'll help guard the secret, sir." Outside, the morning's fog had lifted completely, revealing a bright, clear day. The crowds around Palace continued their tours and photos, unaware of the profound events that had transpired beneath their feet. But now there were a few who knew, a group of teenagers who had learned about respect and judgment, a guard who finally understood his family's legacy, and an old soldier who had, at last, fulfilled his promise. Harold took one last look at the palace before turning to leave. This time, no one mocked him. Instead, the teenagers formed an impromptu honor guard, standing straight and proud as he walked between them. "Commander Bennett," James called out as Harold reached the gates. "Will we see you again?" Harold turned back with a smile. "Keep watching the palace gates," he said. "Some promises aren't meant to end, they're meant to be passed on." And as he walked away into the London sunshine, the teenagers understood that they were now part of something greater than themselves, guardians not just of a secret, but of the eternal truth that hope, properly protected and nurtured, could illuminate even the darkest of times. Guard Phillips returned to his post, standing a little straighter, his chest a little prouder. And if visitors noticed that the guards at Palace seemed to carry themselves with an extra measure of dignity, well, that was just another part of the mystery that made the palace special. After all, some promises are meant to be kept not just for a lifetime, but for generations to come, a legacy of light, guarding the eternal flame of human potential.